Am I recording? Yes. Hello again. It's me, Chaz, doing another video. This time, my video is about the FIFA World Cup itself and how it started. The very first World Cup was hosted by Uruguay in 1930. Uruguay also happened to be the Olympic champions at that time. The Olympic Games does play a very important part in the creation of the FIFA World Cup. Now, we can't talk about the FIFA World Cup without talking about the creator of it, probably the most important person in FIFA's history, and that is Jules Rimet, who happened to be the third president of FIFA at the time, being president from 1921 till 1954, making him the longest serving president of FIFA. Jules Rimet is French, making him the second Frenchman to be FIFA president. He's also the founder of the French football team Red Star, who are currently playing in League 2 in France. They were founded in 1897. Under Jules' leadership, over 50 other nations eventually joined FIFA, at least one coming from all 6 zones. His role in FIFA and creating the World Cup was so important and honoured that they actually named the World Cup trophy after him. Jules would pass away in 1956, 2 years after he stepped down as FIFA president at the age of 83. So the question would be, why were Uruguay chosen as the hosts for the 1930 World Cup? One of the main reasons is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, they were the Olympic champions, winning the Olympic Games in 1928. Another reason, in 1830, the Constitution of Uruguay was written up and sworn in by the people. In 1930, that nation would have celebrated 100 years since the Constitution. The Constitution was written up after the Cisplantine War, a war that was between the Empire of Brazil and the United Province of the Rio de la Plata. So these are the 2 reasons why Uruguay were given the World Cup. Okay, so we have a host nation. Now we need other teams, other nations to compete with them. There was a total of 13 teams that competed in the 1930 World Cup, including Uruguay. Originally, there was supposed to be 16 teams, but 3 teams dropped out for their own reasons. South American teams made up the bulk of the nations that competed at the World Cup, 7 of them. 4 came from Europe and 2 from North America. So the 7 nations that came from the CONMEBOL from South America was Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and of course the hosts, Uruguay. There were 4 teams, like I mentioned, that came from Europe, now UEFA. Those teams were Yugoslavia, who no longer exist, France, Romania, and Belgium, both France and Belgium being 2 of the founding members of FIFA. And finally, there were 2 nations from North America, now the CONCACAF. Those 2 nations were Mexico and United States of America. So those were the 13 nations who were the first nations to ever compete at a World Cup. Let's call them the original 13. All 13 nations do go on to compete at other World Cups. In one case, Brazil, who have competed in every World Cup. And not just competing, a total of 6 of these nations also went on to hosting the World Cup, and in some cases twice, such as France and Mexico. In one case, Mexico will be hosting a World Cup for a third time, as well as the USA for a second time as co-hosts for the 2026 World Cup. Brazil is also another nation that has hosted the World Cup two times, hosting it in 1950 after the 8-year hiatus because of the World War. And Brazil also managed to host the World Cup again in 2014. I haven't mentioned, but the winners of this World Cup also happen to be the hosts, Uruguay, them being the first host nation as well as the first nation to ever win a World Cup. This would happen again another 5 times. The next World Cup after this in 1934, Italy were the host nations and they won. Again, England in 66, Germany in 74, Argentina in 78, and most recently, although it's been more than 20 years now, France in 1998. The finals took place in Estadio Centenario Montevideo, which is the capital of Uruguay. Oh man, I really hope I said that right. Argentina and Uruguay competed in the final. Uruguay beat Argentina 4-2. Estadio Centenario was created for the World Cup, but also to celebrate at the time 100 years for the Constitution of Uruguay. The ground is Uruguay's national stadium. To this day, they still play games there. All of their home games there. This ground is just so important. The fact that the very first World Cup final was actually played there, it just makes it that much special of a ground. It is recognised by FIFA as the first historical monument to world football. That's just how important this ground was and how important this World Cup was to football. As of now, it is the only historical monument to world football. Definitely would love to go to that ground one day, just to see it. Out of the 18 games that was played at this World Cup, 10 of them was played here, including the final, as I mentioned, and the 2 semi-finals. There were a total of 3 stadiums used for this tournament, the smallest amount of stadiums for any World Cup. There was 2 other stadiums. Their names are Estadio Pocitos and Estadio Gran Parque Central. Those were the 2 other stadiums. So, like I said, a total of 3 different stadiums, and they are pretty close to each other. I believe the only other World Cup to have stadiums so close to each other is the most recent one in Qatar. Yeah. I believe also that the fact is that all of the games were played in the same city in Montevideo. So that's another reason.
The tournament lasted for 18 days, starting on the 13th of July to the 30th of July, making it one of the shorter tournaments. Compare that to the most recent World Cup in Qatar, where it started on the 20th of November 2022 to the 18th of December. The 1930 World Cup was 10 days less than the World Cup in Qatar in 2022.
And it will get longer. The next World Cup would have more teams, so more matches. Okay, let's get down to how the tournament's supposed to work. So there are supposed to be 4 groups of 4 teams, and the winner of each group would qualify for the next round, which will end up just being a semi-final between the 4 top teams of their group. Now, unfortunately, 3 teams couldn't make it to that World Cup, which meant that only one group, and that would have been Group 1, had 4 teams, while the other 3 groups had three teams. The three nations that didn't make it to this World Cup. One was an African nation, and that was Egypt. The other two were Asian nations. That was both Japan and Thailand. If these three nations did make the trip to that World Cup at the time, they would have, of course, been the first Asian and African nations to have competed at a World Cup. Both Thailand and Japan pulled out, and Egypt, on the other hand, they unfortunately missed their boat. Now, this is obviously probably the key reasons why a lot of nations all around the world didn't choose to compete at this World Cup, because back then the only means of travel was by boats, and we're talking extremely long journeys to Uruguay. So for the South American nations, it was an easier trip for them to get there, and even the two North American nations, both Mexico and USA, maybe a bit longer. But again, it would have been an easier trip for them compared to the European nations and the three nations that didn't go, Egypt, Japan and Thailand, that would have had to make an even longer journey to Uruguay. So it's understandable why they didn't make the journey, but a lot of credit given to these nations, these people, these footballers and coaches that were able to make that journey. You know, they would have left their families for a long time, and now I'm not sure if they were going to get back. It could have been a dangerous trip. So a lot of credit to them for making that journey. And I guess if they didn't, we wouldn't know where football is at this point, at least when it comes to international football. So much credit to all of them. Quick thing about all three nations, Japan, Egypt and Thailand. Japan did eventually compete at World Cup. The first World Cup was in 1998, and they went on to actually host the next World Cup after that in 2002, with South Korea being the first Asian nations to ever host a World Cup. Indonesia are officially the first Asian nation to compete at a World Cup finals in 1938 in France, before their independence, known as the Dutch East Indies. Indonesia has inherited the Dutch East Indies record by FIFA. So their record is Indonesia's record now. And finally, Egypt, even though they did miss the boat in 1930, in 1934, they did compete at that World Cup, becoming the very first African nation to compete at a World Cup. I should mention that there was a storm in the Mediterranean which delayed Egypt, and that's why they missed their boat to go to Uruguay. So I mentioned the curator, I mentioned the host nation, I also mentioned all the countries that competed with the hosts to win this tournament. Now let's go on to the actual groups and what countries were in each group, starting with Group 1. Now again, the nation that tops their group goes on to compete in the final four. So the four nations that competed in the first group of the World Cup 1930 Uruguay was Argentina, Chile, France and Mexico. Now, interesting thing about this group, all four of these nations will go on to host the World Cup at least twice, and in one case will host it 3 times, like I mentioned before, Mexico. Argentina will go on to, in this tournament in 1930, will be the runners-up, but they would also host the World Cup in 1978, where they would go on to win it, win the World Cup again in 1986, and currently they are the World Cup holders, beating, funny enough, France, who also happened to be in their group in the last World Cup in 2022. Chile would go on to host in the World Cup in 1962. Also, it was their best performance of a World Cup when they finished third. France would host the third World Cup in 1938. 60 years from then, they will go on to host the World Cup for a second time in 1998, winning their very first World Cup. And in 2018, they go on to win the World Cup again for a second time. They are as of now, they are the runners-up for the last World Cup, losing to Argentina, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, Mexico. Mexico were the first nation from the CONCACAF to host the World Cup. They also became the first nation to host 2 World Cups, and they will be the first nation to ever host 3 World Cups when they co-host it with both USA and Canada in 2026. The first World Cup matches to have been played, one of them was from this group. That match was played between Mexico and France. The other match was played in Group 4. That was between the USA and Belgium. The game between France and Mexico, the very first goal scorer of a World Cup goal was Laurent, who scored in France's 4-1 win over Mexico. And in the other game between USA and Belgium, USA won 3-0 in Group 4. USA getting a clean sheet, the first nation to get a clean sheet at the World Cup. Jimmy Douglas was their goalkeeper. Okay, back to Group 1. After France's win against Mexico, 2 days later they would go on to play Argentina, playing this time at the Gran Parque Central Stadium. They would lose this time though to Argentina 1-0. This is the very first time Argentina and France met each other at the World Cup. The next day, Chile will start their World Cup campaign playing Mexico. Mexico are trying to bounce back from their defeat to France, but again they end up losing, this time 3-0 to Chile. Mexico, after this loss, it was impossible for them to qualify, knocking them out of the World Cup. They also happened to have scored the very first World Cup own goal. Rosas scored. But after this win, both Argentina, France, as well as Chile all happened to have 2 points at the time. Now, I should have established this earlier, but during the 1930s and during these World Cups, that if a team was to win a game, they would only get 2 points, not 3 points. And if a team was to draw, they would get 1 point. So at this point in time, in this game, on this table, Argentina had 2 points, France had 2 points, and Chile also had 2 points. Mexico, on the other hand, had 0 points. Chile and France, another match that's extremely important, both teams. If France did win this game, they would put them back in a better position to qualify for the World Cup last 4. Chile, on the other hand, if they did win this game, they would make them top and would have eliminated France. And that's what happened. Chile won this game 1-0, eliminating France from the tournament and putting themselves in a positive, great position to get out of the group and compete in the last 4 of the World Cup. What also happened that day, on the same day, the 19th of July, Argentina played Mexico. Argentina went on to beat Mexico 6-3, putting themselves top of the table at the end of that day. So both Chile and Argentina were both on 4 points. France on 2, Mexico 0, no points. So both Mexico and France were eliminated on the same. Mexico was already eliminated. France was eliminated again, which makes the final match between Argentina and Chile important. Whoever won that game would have went on to get out of the group and go on to the last 4. Argentina did win, beating Chile 3-1 in the Stadio Central game. Argentina was able to get out of their group, maximum points, and a very impressive goal difference. At least very, very impressive amount of goals that they scored, I should say. So the 6-3 between Argentina and Mexico was the most goals that were scored at this World Cup in 1930. Another note from that match, Manuel Rosas, he is the first player to score a penalty. So as well as being the first one to score an own goal, he also happens to be the first player in the World Cup history to also score a penalty. So moving on to Group T, there was only 3 nations in this one: Yugoslavia, Brazil, Bolivia. Yugoslavia, surprisingly at the time, were the nation that actually went through in this group, managing to beat both Brazil and Bolivia. They beat Brazil 2-1 in the opener, and then 4-0 against Bolivia, winning, which meant Brazil played Bolivia at the end, which in the last game of that group, but I think Yugoslavia managed to qualify for the next round. And okay, with the 3 nations in Group 2 that were in that World Cup, Yugoslavia no longer exists anymore. There are a couple of nations that did come out of Yugoslavia because of the war and has competed at a World Cup since the fall of Yugoslavia. Their only team that FIFA actually recognizes as their successor, though, is Serbia. So Serbia's record is Yugoslavia's record. Yugoslavia do go on to finish 4th again at another World Cup in 1962, where they were defeated by Chile. Chile were the host nations of that World Cup, as mentioned previously. Bolivia do go on to qualify for another World Cup, and that is the 1950 World Cup in Brazil. And finally, Brazil go on to host 2 World Cups, the 1950 World Cup and the 2014 World Cup. As mentioned previously, the 1950 World Cup is the first World Cup since after the World War II. Another thing about Brazil, they are the most successful team at the World Cup, winning 5 World Cups after this tournament, winning in 4 different regions as well. First team to also win the World Cup outside of their region when they won the 1958 World Cup. They're also the first nation to win the World Cup in South Korea, and Japan being a nations. Now Group 3 had the hosts Uruguay in it, but they didn't kick off. The first teams to kick off was Romania, and they played Peru. Romania's journey to the World Cup is very interesting. The actual king of Romania, King Carol II of Romania, actually picked the Romanian team to go. And they started off well. Romania won 3-1 against Peru in the Stadio Pocketus. So a great start for them. Uruguay finally played their very first game in the Estadio Centenario, which was finally ready because the stadium wasn't actually ready to start, but finally was, and they played Peru, where they beat Peru 1-0. A goal by Castro. After both Uruguay and Romania defeated Peru, them two will go on to play each other. The winner of this game would go on to qualify for the finals or semi-finals, for the World Cup. Romania lose 4-0 to Uruguay, and Uruguay go on to the next round. Peru and Romania in later tournaments both do make it out of their group stages a couple of times. Romania, during the 1994 World Cup in USA, they made it to the quarterfinals, where Peru in the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, they made it to the quarterfinals. Uruguay, on the other hand, after winning this World Cup, they do eventually go on to winning the World Cup 20 years later in Brazil. And the last group, Group 4, there were 3 nations, just like there was in Group 2 and Group 3. The 3 nations that competed in this group was the USA, Belgium, and Paraguay. The USA won this group, topping it by beating both Belgium and Paraguay 3-0. And in the second game, where they beat Paraguay 3-0, the very first hat-trick was scored by a man named Bert Patenaude. He was the first player to ever score a hat-trick, played for America, and they beat Paraguay 3-0. With that win over Paraguay, that made the USA top their group. The match between Paraguay and Belgium didn't mean anything, though Paraguay did win 1-0. So now the USA, Yugoslavia, Uruguay, and Argentina were the 4 nations to play in the semi-finals, the very first semi-finals of the World Cup, the very first last 4. The matches took place on the 26th and 27th of July in the Estadio Centenario. Argentina played USA first. They beat them 6-1. And then in the second semi-final between Uruguay and Yugoslavia, the same scoreline, Uruguay won 6-1. Setting up the very first ever World Cup final, the first ever World Cup final between 2 South American teams, and the only final between 2 South American teams. So the finals was between both Uruguay and Argentina, neighbours. John Langinus from Belgium was the referee for this match. He was awarded the referee of this game between the 2 nations, but asked that there was a quick escape route for him to escape back on the boat if there's any problems. Once they said they had a route for him, he decided to ref that game. There was an issue before kick-off deciding whose ball would be used. Argentina wanted to use theirs, Uruguay wanted to use theirs. So John Langinus decided that each team would be able to use their football in each half, so the first half and the second half. Massive celebrations for Uruguay when they won the World Cup, beating Argentina 4-2. Jules Rimet handed over the World Cup to Uruguay's Football Association head, his name Raul Jude. Jules Rimet kept that trophy in his bag for a long time. He travelled there, made the mission to Uruguay as well. Yeah, and this was a massive success for football, for world football. I mean, since then, there's been a further 21 other World Cups after this one. So it's success for international football. After this game, there was more friendlies played with these World Cup nations. So, like I said, overall success. Uruguay, on aggregate, to this day, they have the best goal difference over 4 games. I think that's the best average per match for any World Cup winner. So to this day, that record still stands. So a massive achievement for FIFA. Like I said, this to me is the biggest achievement. FIFA have a retrospective rankings system to show you every nation at that World Cup and every other World Cup after. Show you which was the best team and the worst team. So during the 1930 World Cup, obviously Uruguay is ranked top, Argentina second. Now most World Cups after this one, every World Cup I should say, after the very first World Cup has a third round, has a playoff for the first place. This World Cup didn't have that. But on goal difference, this is why the USA is above Yugoslavia, and hence why the USA for this World Cup would have finished third, and then Yugoslavia fourth. And then further on, it's really based on goal difference, where they rank, and the points as well, where they rank every team that would have got eliminated in group stages. So at this World Cup, for example, Mexico, Bolivia, Belgium and Peru all failed to win a game, or even all failed to get a point. And goal difference, Mexico let in the most goals, scored the fewest as well, hence why Mexico during the 1930 World Cup were bottom. Okay, now before I finish this video, it's been going on for a little while, I'll just mention where each of these nations are currently, and how they will or won't, or if they have already qualified for the World Cup in 2026. So let's start off with the bottom team. That would have been Mexico, who finished 13th in the ranking system. So, as mentioned before, Mexico will be the hosts. They are co-hosts with both the USA and Canada. So, and by that, Mexico have qualified automatically for the next World Cup. Bolivia, who finished 12th in the 1930 World Cup on a ranking system, they are currently 9th in the CONMEBOL's World Cup qualifying table. There's a total of 6 teams in the CONMEBOL that can qualify, so they're not looking in the best position. But qualifiers have only really just gotten started, so maybe. Belgium probably didn't have the best Euros that they didn't. Currently, the UEFA zone hasn't started their qualifiers. The qualifiers will start next year, I believe in March. That's when the World Cup qualifiers for Europe, for the UEFA zone, will start. Peru, just like Bolivia, Peru is actually doing worse than Bolivia. They're currently 10th, bottom of the table in the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifiers. Again, it's still early, maybe. We'll see. Now Paraguay, another team in the CONMEBOL. They're currently 7th. At this point in time, if the World Cup qualifiers for the CONMEBOL zone finish and end, they will get a playoff position spot by finishing 7th, which will give them another chance to qualify for the 2026 World Cup, but they would have to play a nation outside of the CONMEBOL. And if they do win that, and if they're ranked high enough, they would only have to play once. But if they're ranked lower than that, they would have to play at least 2 times before they have a chance of qualifying. Romania and France both 7th and 8th respectively. Like I mentioned with Belgium, because the Eurozone, UEFA zone, hasn't started the World Cup qualifiers, we'll see how far both nations will go. Brazil are currently 6th in the World Cup qualifiers in the CONMEBOL. That would just about have them qualify for the World Cup. Again, still early. And Chile, who are currently 8th in the CONMEBOL themselves. Again, so they're still kicked off. I keep saying it's early, so we'll see. Anything could happen at this time. But yeah, they're currently 8th in the CONMEBOL table. Yugoslavia, as I mentioned, no longer exist. But they were in Europe, they are in Europe. So UEFA zone hasn't started, so their successor team, Serbia, all the other nations that were once a part of them, all haven't started yet for the World Cup qualifiers. So we will see what happens next year. The USA, similar to Mexico, co-hosting with Canada as well. So because of that, they automatically have qualified for the World Cup in 2026. Okay, now Argentina, who were the runners-up of this World Cup in 1930. What are the current holders of the World Cup? They are currently top of the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifier table. And finally, the hosts of the 1930 World Cup and the winners, Uruguay, they are currently 2nd in the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifiers. So yeah, that's where all the teams, the original 13 teams, are in their progress to the 2026 World Cup. This has been my video about the World Cup, how it started, the very first World Cup in 1930. Appreciate watching, listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.